The house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall, a constant, rhythmic reminder of time slipping away. It was just after 9:00 p.m., and the soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the stillness. The protagonist, sitting in the dimly lit living room, could feel the weight of the letter in their hands like a heavy stone. Every word felt like a blade to their chest, sharp and cold. They stared at the letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, their eyes scanning the official-looking paper, but none of it made sense. The HOA was blocking the installation of the medical equipment that their disabled brother desperately needed. The words jumped out: non-compliance with aesthetic standards, violation of neighborhood rules, unauthorized modifications. It was maddening. Their brother's condition was deteriorating by the day, and this absurd bureaucracy was standing in the way of his survival. Click, click, click. The clock on the wall continued its unrelenting march forward. It felt like every second that passed was a life lost, and the protagonist could almost hear their brother gasping in the next room, struggling to breathe. The weight of the decision pressed down on them. The HOA wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to their brother's life. They crushed the letter in their hand, feeling the paper crinkle like a distant echo of their frustration. The quiet house seemed to grow darker, colder with every passing minute. How did it come to this? Their brother had been born with a rare respiratory condition, one that required constant care and life-sustaining equipment. Medical supplies, large oxygen tanks, a portable ventilator, and a medical bed had been delivered to the house only days before, but the HOA had sent a letter within hours, claiming that these items violated their community guidelines. No matter that the equipment was essential for the brother's survival, or that the family had already received all necessary medical approvals, all that mattered to the HOA was maintaining the look of the neighborhood. This can't be happening, the protagonist thought, but the hard truth was right in front of them. Their hands trembled as they set the letter on the coffee table, the silence now deafening. The clock ticked louder now, almost mocking them. As the realization hit, the HOA had all the power, and their brother's life was caught in the crossfire. "Hey," a voice broke through the tension. Their brother's voice, weak but steady, calling from the hallway. The protagonist snapped to attention, fear flashing across their face. They rushed toward the bedroom, finding their brother lying in his bed, a tangle of tubes and machines around him. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat covering his forehead, and his breathing was shallow. "Are they going to take it away?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. The oxygen mask that covered his face did little to disguise the strain in his voice. The protagonist swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in their throat. "I'll fix this," they whispered, though their heart wasn't sure anymore. But before they could say anything more, their phone buzzed on the bedside table. The message was brief. "Meeting with the HOA board tomorrow at noon. They want to discuss your brother's equipment. They're not backing down." The protagonist's stomach tightened. The stakes were rising faster than they could grasp, and time was slipping through their fingers like sand. The clock ticked on. The question echoed in the protagonist's mind. Would they be too late? The phone rang again, and again, and again. Each call felt like a hammer blow against their sanity, each conversation a repetitive, suffocating cycle of scripted responses that went nowhere. The protagonist gripped the phone tightly, their knuckles white, as yet another HOA representative droned on in the same monotone voice they had heard for the past hour. Each word was laced with the same indifferent finality, like a door slamming shut in their face. "Unfortunately, as stated in the community guidelines," the voice continued, "the modifications you're requesting are considered an eyesore and must be removed." The protagonist clenched their jaw, trying to contain the boiling frustration rising within them. The letter from the HOA was sitting on the kitchen counter, a stark reminder that this wasn't just bureaucracy, it was personal. They glanced over at their brother's bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, their brother lay motionless, his oxygen mask hissing with a gentle rhythm. But it wasn't enough. The equipment they'd installed was a lifeline, the only thing keeping him alive. The thought of losing it because of a group of strangers who saw nothing but rules and appearances made their blood boil. "Look," the protagonist said, cutting off the representative's monologue, "my brother's condition is life-threatening. This isn't about some garden decoration or a mailbox. We're talking about his health here." The voice on the other end was unfazed. "I understand your concern, but unless we receive approval from the board, we cannot make exceptions." The protagonist slammed the phone down on the receiver, feeling the heat of frustration surge through their veins. It wasn't just one person. They had spoken to 3, 4, 5 different people, each repeating the same cold script, as though they had no understanding of the stakes. The rules were all that mattered, the human cost irrelevant. Outside, the night pressed in on the house, dark and unyielding. The headlights of passing cars flashed by the windows in staccato bursts, as if the outside world was moving on without them. The house felt smaller now, darker, as though the walls were closing in, and the clock ticked louder than ever. Tick, tick, tick. It was the kind of sound that gnawed at the edges of sanity, the relentless countdown to something they could not control. A sharp knock on the door interrupted the suffocating silence. The protagonist froze. Their heart skipped a beat, and a flash of panic surged through them. Could it be the HOA? Were they here to issue an eviction notice, or worse, have the medical equipment removed? They hesitated, then rushed to the door, flinging it open. Standing there in the dim light was their father, his face drawn with concern, his eyes narrowed with determination. "We need to act fast," he said, stepping into the foyer, voice low but urgent. "You're not getting anywhere with them. They're stonewalling you on purpose. It's not just about rules. It's about power." The protagonist stared at him, their mind racing. Power. The HOA was standing in their way, but what could they do? The phone calls had yielded nothing. The paperwork, the appeals, it all felt futile. Despair crept in, a cold hand settling in their chest. "What do you mean?" the protagonist asked, their voice barely above a whisper. "We need leverage," their father replied, his eyes narrowing, as if he were seeing something the protagonist couldn't. "And I know just where to get it." The protagonist's heart skipped. What could he mean? What leverage could possibly make the HOA back down? The answer was right in front of them. But it would require a kind of power they hadn't considered. In the distance, the faintest hum of a car engine could be heard pulling into the driveway. But it wasn't just any car. The sound was unmistakable. A black sit-in. The kind that didn't belong in a neighborhood like this. The protagonist's pulse quickened as their father turned toward the door, a knowing glint in his eyes. He didn't have to say it. They both knew. This was just the beginning. The night felt like it was closing in around them, thick with tension and unspoken words. The air was heavy, stifling, as if the house itself knew something was about to change. The black sit-in that had just rolled into the driveway remained parked, its headlights casting long shadows across the front lawn. The protagonist watched from the window, their heart hammering in their chest. Their father stood by the door, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, a grim look on his face. "We need to make sure we do this right," their father said quietly, his eyes scanning the yard, his voice unusually low and steady. "It's not just about fixing this situation. We need to strike at the heart of the problem." The protagonist's pulse quickened. What did he mean by that? What was their father planning? Before they could ask, the doorbell rang. It chimed sharp in the otherwise silent house. The protagonist turned toward it, but their father was already moving toward the door, his footsteps deliberate, confident. The moment felt surreal. They had tried every legal avenue, every direct confrontation with the HOA, but it had been fruitless. They needed something, or someone, to tip the scales. The door creaked open. There, standing on the doorstep, was their sister. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was undeniable, calm, calculating, with the air of someone who had seen the worst of the world and always came out on top. The suit she wore, dark and sharp, only made her more formidable. Her gaze locked with the protagonist's for a fraction of a second before she stepped inside without a word. "I thought you'd need some help," she said, her voice even, but with an edge of determination that sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. "You're here," the protagonist whispered, barely able to believe it. "But how did you?" Their sister raised an eyebrow, the faintest smile playing at the corner of her lips. "When you called, I knew exactly what kind of fight this would be, and I have the tools to end it." She glanced at their father, who nodded solemnly. "What's going on?" the protagonist demanded. "What tools? What do you mean?" Their sister's eyes softened slightly, but there was a cold steel in them that was unmistakable. The HOA doesn't know it yet, but they've made a powerful enemy. And this time, they won't be able to hide behind their rules and regulations. She motioned toward the front door, where the black Satan sat like a silent sentinel. "I've already started. All I need from you is to keep your brother safe and stay out of my way for now." The protagonist's heart skipped. Their sister's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "Started? What do you mean?" "I've got connections, leverage they'll never see coming," she replied. "They're not going to get away with this. Not on my watch." The tension in the room was palpable. The protagonist knew their sister worked in the FBI, but they had never fully grasped the extent of her influence. She was a force in the shadows, a quiet storm waiting to break. And now, that storm was headed straight for the HOA. "But," the protagonist's voice faltered as they tried to wrap their head around the enormity of what their sister was suggesting. "But this isn't just about the HOA. It's about our brother. We're running out of time." Their sister stepped forward, her eyes never leaving the protagonist's. "I know. That's why we're going to act fast. But we need to hit them where it hurts." With a flick of her wrist, she pulled out a sleek, black tablet and began tapping away, the screen flickering with coded data that the protagonist couldn't quite understand. But the look on their sister's face said everything. They were about to launch an attack of a different kind. Suddenly, the door creaked again. The headlights of the black Satan flickered off, and the sound of footsteps outside reached their ears. This wasn't just a meeting. This wasn't just a confrontation. The game had just changed. The protagonist felt a jolt of adrenaline shoot through their veins. "Get ready," their sister said, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "We're not just fighting for your brother's medical access anymore. We're going to expose the truth behind this entire operation." With that, she stood and turned toward the door, her footsteps deliberate, each one signaling that the battle was now fully underway. The house was quiet, but the tension in the air crackled with the promise of something coming. The protagonist stood frozen in the hallway, watching as their sister, the FBI agent, moved with purpose toward the door. With each step, the room seemed to grow colder, darker, as though the weight of what was happening pressed down on the very air they breathed. "Are you sure about this?" the protagonist asked, barely able to suppress the tremor in their voice. They had seen their sister handle countless cases, navigate dangerous investigations with ease, but this wasn't just another criminal case. This was their family. Their brother's life was on the line. Their sister didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stopped by the door, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of her phone. The dim light from the kitchen flickered off the screen as she glanced down. The tablet she had been working on earlier buzzed in her hand. The tap of her fingers on the glass was rhythmic, almost soothing, but the protagonist could sense the controlled fury in her actions. "You're about to see how I've been making waves in the right places," she said, eyes fixed on the screen. The way she spoke was calm, but there was an edge to her voice that sent a shiver up the protagonist's spine. "The HOA won't know what hit them." A loud ding rang through the room, and the protagonist's sister glanced up, her face suddenly steely. "It's time." The atmosphere in the house seemed to shift. The protagonist couldn't tell if it was the sudden chill of the evening air seeping through the walls, or the quiet, invisible tension building around them. Their sister was no longer just their sibling. She was something else now. An agent, a force, ready to unleash a storm. Without another word, she turned and strode out the door, the protagonist following her in a daze. They crossed the threshold into the night, the cool wind hitting their skin like a slap. In the distance, the black sedan remained parked, its engine humming softly as if waiting for its next move. Their sister reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a set of keys, and unlocked the door to the sedan. The protagonist hesitated, unsure of what was about to unfold. As they slid into the back seat beside her, the car roared to life, pulling away from the curb with a smooth, controlled precision. "Where are we going?" the protagonist asked, their voice shaky with anticipation. "To the source," their sister replied, her tone unwavering. "We're going straight to the top." The city lights blurred past them, the night filled with a buzz of unseen energy as the cars sped through the streets. It wasn't long before they pulled up to a sleek building in the heart of the city, a corporate tower that seemed to touch the sky. The building exuded power, confidence, and the kind of wealth that could make or break lives with the stroke of a pen. This was where the HOA's leadership resided. This was where the battle would truly begin. Inside, the protagonist's sister moved with the grace of someone who had done this countless times before. They passed through the lobby with a sense of quiet authority, drawing the eyes of anyone who happened to glance their way. The protagonist felt like an outsider, out of place, but they couldn't deny the energy in the air. Their sister wasn't here just to talk. She was here to make an impact. They took the elevator up to the top floor, where the doors opened with a soft ding. As they walked down the corridor, the lights seemed to flicker above them, casting long shadows that made everything feel surreal, like they were entering a world of shadows and secrets. The protagonist's heart hammered in their chest, but it wasn't fear they felt. It was anticipation, a sharp electric feeling that was building with every step. They reached a large office at the end of the hall, where the doors stood wide open. Inside, a man in a crisp suit stood at a sleek desk, papers scattered in front of him. But as soon as he saw their sister, his expression shifted, cold, calculating, and suddenly aware that the tables had turned. "Let's talk," she said, stepping into the room. Her voice was a calm command, and the man stiffened, as if sensing the storm that was about to break. The protagonist watched as their sister crossed the room, the air thick with the tension of what was about to happen. The man's eyes darted to the documents on his desk, then back to her. He knew she was FBI, but what he didn't know was how deeply their investigation had already reached. The trap had been set. And now, it was time to spring it. The room felt like it was closing in around them, the walls heavy with the weight of power, secrets, and danger. The protagonist stood in the corner of the sleek office, barely able to breathe as they watched their sister close the door behind them. Her movements were deliberate, confident, like a lion about to strike, and the man at the desk, CEO of the HOA, a man used to controlling everything, could sense it. He straightened, his back rigid, eyes narrowing, but the silence between them was suffocating. "We're not here to negotiate," the sister said, her voice smooth as velvet, but the underlying steel was unmistakable. "We're here to make you pay." The CEO's gaze flickered to the door, his fingers twitching as if he were considering a move, but he stayed seated, his hand resting on the edge of the polished desk. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," he said, his voice carrying a thin veneer of confidence that barely masked the tension underneath. "This is a private matter. You have no jurisdiction here." The sister smirked, unfazed. "Funny, that's what you think." Without warning, she placed a small device on the table between them. It was sleek, almost innocuous, but the sharp click of a button being pressed made the protagonist's heart race. Click. The soft beep that followed was a sign that something had just been activated, something that would tip the scales. The man's eyes widened for just a second, but it was enough to show that he understood. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice suddenly strained. Evidence, the sister replied simply, her eyes locked on him with an intensity that could melt steel. She tapped the tablet in her hand, and the screen came to life, flashing a series of images, documents, and emails that made the CEO's face drain of color. Each piece of information hit him like a punch, each one revealing a deeper layer of corruption and criminal activity hidden within the HOA's operations. The protagonist stepped forward, drawn into the gravity of what was unfolding. They had no idea the depths the HOA had sunk to in order to maintain their control. The evidence was damning: money laundering, illegal contracts, discrimination against families like theirs. But what struck the protagonist most was the realization that their brother's medical access had been just one small piece in a much larger, much darker puzzle. The CEO's voice cracked as he stood, his hand shaking, his composure slipping. "You can't." "Oh, I can," their sister said, her eyes never leaving him. "And I will. This isn't just about your petty rules anymore. You've crossed a line, and now the entire network you've built is exposed." The CEO took a step back, his eyes darting to the door, to the windows, as if he was looking for a way out, but there was none. The storm had arrived. The power he had wielded for so long was crumbling around him. His empire was collapsing, and he knew it. The sister pressed on, her voice unwavering. "Do you know how many people you've hurt for the sake of your little community standards? How many lives you've destroyed with your greed and disregard for human life? This is only the beginning." The room felt like it was pulsing with energy now. The air was thick with anticipation. The CEO's mind raced as he tried to find a way to salvage something, anything. But it was clear now. There was no escape. "I've already made calls to your board members," the sister continued, her tone cold, calculating. "They're going to have a little conversation about their financial backers. You might want to get ahead of that." The CEO's face twisted, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His empire was crumbling faster than he could grasp, and it was all thanks to one family. Their family. But just as he was about to make a move, the sister's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, then back at the CEO, a slow, almost predatory smile crossing her face. "It's over." She turned toward the protagonist, her expression softening for the first time since they had walked into the room. "We've got everything we need. It's done." The protagonist felt a rush of disbelief, followed by a rush of something else. Relief. But the relief was fleeting, because they knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger storm. The CEO, now desperate, stammered one last attempt to salvage his reputation, but it was too late. The power had shifted, and he was no longer in control. As they turned to leave, the protagonist glanced back one final time, watching as the man crumpled into his chair, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The fight for their brother's life wasn't over, but the battle had just taken an unexpected turn. The elevator doors slid shut behind them with a soft final ding, but the tension inside the small space was palpable, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The protagonist's heart was still racing, the adrenaline of what they had just witnessed coursing through their veins. Their sister had done it, exposed the corrupt foundation of the HOA with cold precision, but the battle was far from over. The evidence was now in the hands of the authorities, but the question lingered: what would happen next? As the elevator descended, the protagonist couldn't help but glance over at their sister. She stood with her arms crossed, her face expressionless, but there was a certain calmness about her now, a quiet certainty that everything was unfolding just as it should. The storm she had unleashed was only beginning to roll across the horizon, but already its echoes were shaking the foundations of the powerful. "Do you think he'll go down easy?" the protagonist asked, unable to mask the anxiety in their voice. Their sister's lips curled into a faint smile. The ones who think they're untouchable usually crumble the hardest. But even as she spoke, there was something unsettling in her eyes, a flicker of something that suggested this victory wasn't the end. There was more to come, and it wasn't just about the HOA anymore. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft jolt, and the doors opened to the bustling lobby of the corporate building. The world outside felt so normal, so oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred behind closed doors. But the protagonist knew better. Things were changing, and fast. As they stepped out into the parking garage, the quiet hum of the city felt distant, muffled, like the calm before a storm. The protagonist looked over at the black sedan that had brought them here. Their sister slid into the driver's seat with a fluid motion, and the protagonist followed, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. As the car pulled out of the garage and into the night, the protagonist's thoughts raced. What now? The CEO had been exposed, but his influence didn't end with a few documents. The HOA had its hands in far more than anyone had imagined. And their brother. His medical equipment might have been saved, for now. But there was no guarantee the war was over. No guarantee that the powers behind the HOA wouldn't strike back. The cars sped through the streets, the city lights blurring past like fleeting memories. It was late, too late for anyone to be awake, too late to get any real answers. But the protagonist could feel the unsettling silence of it all. The calm before the real storm. "I need to know more," the protagonist said, voice tight with urgency. "There's more to this, isn't there? The HOA. They're just the tip of the iceberg. This runs deeper, doesn't it?" Their sister didn't respond immediately, her eyes scanning the road, the flickering streetlights casting shadows across her face. For a moment, the protagonist thought they might not get an answer. But then their sister spoke, her voice low, like a secret shared between only them. "Yeah, you're right. The HOA was just the start." She paused, glancing over at the protagonist, her expression unreadable. "What we're dealing with here, it's bigger than we thought. The people behind that organization are well connected. They've been using their power to manipulate everything, but we're just getting started." The protagonist's stomach tightened. "Who are they?" Their sister's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. For the first time, the protagonist saw a trace of unease in her gaze. "I don't know yet, but I've got people working on it." As they turned onto a quieter street, the protagonist glanced out the window, the bright city lights fading into the distance as they drove deeper into the unknown. Their mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The HOA was just the front. The CEO, a puppet in a much larger game. And their brother, was he just a casualty of a deeper plot? "Do you think they'll come after us?" the protagonist asked, voice barely above a whisper. The thought of retaliation sent a chill down their spine. Their sister's expression hardened. "Let them come. We're ready." The car pulled into a nondescript parking lot behind an old warehouse, far from the prying eyes of the city. Their sister cut the engine, and they sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the journey ahead pressing down on them. "Get out," their sister said, her voice firm. "It's time to go to war. But first, I need you to trust me." The protagonist nodded, fear mixing with an overwhelming sense of purpose. They didn't know what was about to happen, but one thing was certain. They were all in this together. And no matter the danger, they would fight to the end. The heavy door to the warehouse creaked open with an eerie groan, the air inside thick with the scent of old wood and metal. The protagonist followed their sister into the shadows, the click of their footsteps echoing in the silence, amplified by the vast emptiness around them. It was hard to believe they were standing in a place so far removed from the world they knew, yet it felt like the calm before a storm, the quiet that precedes a battle. "Where are we?" the protagonist asked, their voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile sense of security that still clung to them. The sister didn't look back. She was already moving toward a door at the far end of the warehouse, the faintest glow of light filtering through the cracks. "This is where the real work happens," she said, her tone businesslike, devoid of emotion. "The next step." The protagonist's heart hammered in their chest. What was going on? Their sister had been calm, confident, but now there was an edge to her, an urgency in her movements that spoke volumes. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, the protagonist felt the weight of something darker, more dangerous pressing in on them. Something wasn't right, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to cross a line they couldn't uncross. They reached the door, and the sister paused for a moment, her hand resting on the cold handle. This is where we find out just how deep this goes. You've seen the evidence, the tip of the iceberg. Now, we dig. The door swung open to reveal a dimly lit room filled with screens, wires, and the hum of technology. In the center stood a man, hunched over a laptop, his fingers moving rapidly across the keys. The glow of the screens reflected off his glasses, casting an almost ghostly light on his face. He didn't look up as they entered, but his voice was calm, steady when he spoke. "Everything is ready. The trace is almost complete," the man said, his voice gravelly, as if he had been working nonstop for days. The protagonist's sister nodded, her gaze flicking over to the screens. "Let's see what we're dealing with. We need names, locations, anything that will bring them down." The man pushed a few more buttons, and the screen shifted, flashing with a series of maps, encrypted files, and complex data. The protagonist leaned in, trying to make sense of it all, but it was like watching a foreign language unfold before their eyes. What they could make out was chilling. Hidden financial accounts, encrypted communications, and connections that reached far beyond the HOA. "It's a network," the man said, his voice grim. "A web of influence, carefully constructed. The HOA was just one piece. But these people," he paused, looking up for the first time, his eyes dark with realization. "They're everywhere. Political leaders, business tycoons. They've been pulling strings for years." The protagonist felt their stomach drop. The corruption wasn't just limited to the HOA. It was far larger than they had imagined, sprawling across the country, maybe even the world. Their brother's medical access, the thing that had started this entire fight, was just one small casualty in a game far bigger than any of them. "This is bigger than we thought," the protagonist said, their voice shaking. "How do we stop it?" Their sister's eyes met theirs, cold and unwavering. "We expose them. All of them. We cut off their lifelines, one by one. They've been hiding behind shadows, thinking they're untouchable. Now they have a target on their backs." But just as she spoke, the room seemed to vibrate with a low, almost imperceptible hum, a sudden warning in the air. The man at the laptop froze, his fingers halting mid-air. His eyes shot to the screen, and his expression shifted to one of horror. "They've detected us. They're onto us." The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. What does that mean? Who's onto us? The man's fingers flew across the keys as panic spread across his face. Someone's traced the signal. They know we're in here. Before the protagonist could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, growing louder and faster. The door to the warehouse slammed open, and 3 men in dark suits stormed in, their faces masked by shadows. The protagonist's sister immediately stepped forward, her posture shifting to one of readiness. "Get out of here," she hissed to the protagonist, her voice low and urgent. "I'll handle this." But the protagonist didn't move. "I'm not leaving." Their sister's eyes locked onto theirs, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The calm, calculating exterior she had shown so far cracked for just an instant, and the weight of the situation sank in. "I need you to trust me," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the impending danger. "Go. Now." The protagonist hesitated, but the sound of approaching footsteps made the decision for them. The time for hesitation was over. As they turned and ran toward the back exit, the sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the room, followed by a flurry of shouting voices. The protagonist's pulse raced, but they didn't stop. Every step was a frantic race against time. But they knew one thing: This fight was far from over. The storm had just begun. The air was thick with the sound of chaos. Footsteps echoed behind the protagonist, their heart pounding in their chest as they ran through the back corridors of the warehouse. The cold, metallic scent of the space was suffocating, the sharp clatter of boots on the concrete floor growing louder with each passing second. They could feel the adrenaline surge through their veins, urging them to move faster. But they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. Each turn felt like a step closer to the unknown. The shadows around them seemed to close in, as if the walls themselves were closing down. Their sister had told them to go, but the words felt like they were echoing in their mind in a distant, almost unreal way. Trust me. The weight of that sentence gnawed at them, but they couldn't help it. They couldn't just leave her behind. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. They reached a door at the back of the building, their fingers scrambling to unlock it, but it was stuck. Panic flickered in their chest. The footsteps were close now, too close. The sound of muffled voices and the unmistakable click of a gun safety being disengaged was enough to freeze them in place for just a moment. Then, with one final, desperate push, the door gave way. The fresh night air hit them like a wave, the darkened streets offering a brief moment of sanctuary as they stumbled out into the open. But just as they thought they had escaped, a hand grabbed their shoulder, yanking them back. They spun, heart leaping into their throat, only to come face to face with the sister, alive, unscathed, her expression cold and focused. "We need to move," she said, pulling them toward the car parked across the street, her voice steady despite the tension thickening the air. Now, the protagonist didn't ask questions. They didn't have time. They ran to the car, the sound of the pursuit still echoing in their ears. But it was different now. The stakes had changed. This was no longer just about saving their brother. It was about stopping a network of power and corruption that had poisoned everything it touched. As the car tore down the street, the protagonist looked over at their sister, still as calm and unshaken as ever. But there was something in her eyes now, something that told them this was far from over. She had seen the darkness of what they were up against, and she wasn't just going to fight. It was personal now. "They're going to come for us," the protagonist said, voice tight with the weight of what had just unfolded. "This isn't over." Their sister nodded, hands gripping the wheel with a strength that betrayed the calm exterior. "I know, but we'll be ready. We're not backing down." The car zipped through the streets, the lights blurring into streaks of color as they sped toward an uncertain future. The protagonist felt their stomach twist, the enormity of it all sinking in. This wasn't just about exposing a corrupt HOA anymore. This was about tearing down an entire system built on manipulation and lies. The city passed by in a haze, but their sister didn't slow down. "We've got one shot at this. One chance to bring down every single person involved." The protagonist's pulse quickened. "What do we do now?" "We find the source," she said, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "The ones who pulled the strings. The ones at the very top." They turned down a narrow alley, the car screeching to a halt outside an abandoned building. It was a nondescript structure, but to the sister, it was everything. The final key in the puzzle they had been assembling, piece by piece. The place where it all ended. "We're here," she said, turning off the engine. The protagonist followed their sister, heart thundering as they walked into the building. It was dim inside, the air stale and heavy with the scent of dust and decay. But the tension was palpable. This was it, the final confrontation. Inside, the room was filled with files, old photos, and documents, a vault of information that would bring everything to light. The protagonist's sister moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the room, already piecing together the last threads of the conspiracy. "There are people here who thought they were untouchable," she said, voice low, almost menacing. "But I'm about to prove them wrong." The protagonist stood back, watching as their sister worked with an intensity that was almost frightening. The truth was about to come out, and the forces that had hidden it for so long would soon be exposed for what they were. In that moment, the protagonist realized something. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for the truth, for everything that had been buried beneath layers of deceit and corruption. They were fighting for a future where families like theirs didn't have to fear the shadows. And they wouldn't stop until the world saw the light.